This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the Saumur S35, a French cavalry tank from the mid-1930s that saw service up to the end of the Second World War.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, the French in the First World War had a very similar experience to the British with their cavalry. The cavalry suffered on the battlefield of the Western Front and ended up fighting very much as infantry in most cases. But the cavalry were not a force that looked backwards all the time in France. As early as 1902, they'd actually experimented with some armoured cars, and the whole essence of the cavalry into that post-war period, post-First World War, they took with them the idea of the mission, not the mount necessarily. In other words, it wasn't just about the horse, it was what was the cavalry was there to do. And in that, they were quite advanced in their thinking in the 1920s and 1930s. And this was led by a French general called Maxime Weygand, who in 1920 said, future wars are going to be about machines, not the horse, or so much about people. But he really concentrates on that word, machines. Now, the French have got a lot of tanks left over after the First World War. In May of 1920, they actually do away with the special force that has been formed around the tank for the French military in World War I, and the tanks are handed over to the infantry. And this is where it becomes a little bit interesting, because the cavalry also want armoured vehicles, but because of the way the Constitution, the law in essence is written, it is only going to be the infantry that can have proper tanks, which, just the same as in America, the cavalry end up having to get round this by calling their vehicles auto militaires, or armoured cars. And they get away with this phrase, armoured cars, when in fact they end up building tanks again, just like the American cavalry ends up doing. Now, you've got over 100 Mark V Star vehicles from Britain that are in French service. They actually see service to the end of the 1920s. You've got, by the end of the First World War, 2,720 FT tanks have been delivered to the French army. And amazingly, in 1934, on the infantry, there's just under 3,500 FT tanks. So there was ones in the production line. Some were sold on, some were gifted abroad, etc. But there's, 3,500 FT tanks. That's a lot of them. And of course, they've also got this famous, they only built 10 of them, but the Char 2C, this 70-ton monster, it's going to be a breakthrough tank, as it were, that it appears lots of times in the French media because of its propaganda purposes. So the French infantry in tanks is quite large. You've then also got, they do a report where they, in 1920, they come up with the idea, lots of different types of vehicles, armoured vehicles are going to be needed in the future. But the truth is, with that post-war period, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the obvious enemy, Germany, is now no longer a threat, or so it seems. And you've got also, the economic recovery of France has to be put as paramount. So the money and the will is not really there to actually take tank development that much further forward, especially as we have a large inventory of tanks sometimes of dubious background, in terms of ability, etc. They may be looking a little old here and there, but actually we've got lots of them in service. So that onus to progress the tank is not there, as it isn't in many countries at around this sort of time. Now, Weygand is quite keen to see the cavalry return to its pre-World War I role, which is the arm of decision. This is the unit that should be doing that final moment on the battlefield, the arm of manoeuvre, that actually does the killer blows to the enemy. And when Weygand becomes Chief of the General Staff in 1930, he's got that opportunity to put his ideas into practice. And what he does is he says, you're going to need, for the cavalry, to meet your future requirements, you're going to need 3 types of vehicles. Now, one of those types of vehicles that's mentioned is probably going to be a half-track, and the cavalry have already experimented in the 1920s with half tracks. This goes back to the Frenchman Cagresse, who has gone out across to Russia. Alphonse Cagresse, he works with the Tsar of Russia, and he puts rubber tracks on some of the Tsar's vehicles so the Tsar can go off hunting, etc., in snowy or boggy weather, and, you know, get that cross-country ability that some form of track will give a vehicle. Now, in 1990, disposal of the Tsar in 1980, 1919, Cagresse comes back and he actually works for Citroën, and he comes up with some vehicles and some ideas for vehicles. 1920, the French do a big expedition across the Sahara, 32 vehicles. Then most of them get bogged down, stuck, or break down. Estienne, the French commander of the tank force and the father figure there in the First World War of the tank, he's the one who suggests, why don't you go to Cagresse and Citroën Cagresse and get some of their vehicles that you might be able to use in the desert. And the following winter, 1922-23, they actually take an expedition across the Sahara with these half-track vehicles, and they get all the way to Timbuktu, and the Cagresse, the track system, is seen as a great success. So the cavalry really like this. They like the idea, so they start developing some half-track vehicles in the 20s and 30s, and they think that this will be good for one of their roles, which is reconnaissance. Now, Weygand, when he says you're going to need 3 types of vehicles, one of them, the AMD vehicle, for that longer range reconnaissance, maybe on roads, but you can get cross-country if you need to. He thinks of a second type of vehicle, an AMR vehicle would be the abbreviation, and that's going to be for closer recce and escort support. And he's really thinking sort of an idea, you know, for protecting flanks, etc. He's thinking there of a lighter tank, probably to fit that role. And for the AMC vehicle, this is the one he's really now saying to the cavalry, you are going to have a good fighting tank, medium weight, well protected, because he thinks you will be entering the fray with enemy tanks at certain times as part of this maneuver battle and the arm of decision. And you're going to have good armor protection and a really good anti-tank gun for taking on enemy tanks if you bump into them. So the AMC he's seeing that as really a fastish medium tank, and something new in essence he's really trying to say for the French military. Now those 3 vehicles will be put together in new French regiments with about the split along the lines of something like 15 of the AMD vehicles, 15 of the AMR vehicles, and 30 of the AMC, this medium tank vehicle, in each of the units, put them together. Now he's coming up with this idea very quickly in 1930. 31, by December of 31, already companies are coming forward with proposals for what might meet the requirements that the cavalry are going to have for this new fleet of vehicles. What can they put into service? Renault offers one of their upgrade vehicles. They're already talking to the French military about replacing the FT tank. Renault look at saying, look, we've got a tracked vehicle that will meet your requirement for the AMC vehicle. The French also approach a subsidiary of Schneider. It's a company called Simua. They are mainly a truck manufacturer. They are making largish lorries, but at this time, France is starting to realise there's a threat of Germany starting to appear in the background, and they're starting to realise we need more armoured vehicle manufacturers. So Simua put forward almost half-heartedly a half-track vehicle as one of their potential bids for this AMC, and it's not particularly looked at favourably by the French military. But the French military go back to Simua and says, look, you know, there's a potential here of an order of 600 vehicles we'll be looking at in the first instance for this new AMC vehicle. So Simua has a rethink, and they actually come back with very quickly working up a prototype. In October 34, they agreed to actually start work. 7 months later, in April 1935, they've come up with the first of their prototypes as an offering for this AMC vehicle, and their prototypes are initialed AC1, AC2, AC3, etc. as they're developing the vehicle. Now, Samura actually employ a chap called Eugene Brill, and he's designed the Schneider tank in the First World War. He's been working fairly recently with Skoda, another one of these Schneider subsidiary companies, on the LTVZ-35 tank, the Czech tank, doing their suspension there. So they've actually got a skill set that they put towards this new vehicle that they're designing. And the army as well is also helping them by sort of saying, listen, here's a firmer specification that's really firmed up in 1934, quite early, and they're saying we want 40 millimeters of armour protection on the vehicle, and that's a lot for this period in the mid-30s. A 47 millimeter anti-tank gun, a rough range of about 200 kilometres, and we think a speed around about 30 kilometres an hour. In other words, we want that depth of penetration, speed to get you there quickly, but good armour protection and a good anti-tank gun if this vehicle is going to be successful. The French army are also very keen with Samura as well, because what they're really trying to do is spread their risk, because there's another problem going on, which is Renault is already taking in a lot of other orders for the other side of French tank development, which is tanks for the infantry. So they've got the Renault UE, or the UE tractor that we've done an earlier tank chat on. So they're already building that. They've got the R35, it's an infantry tank they're starting to develop and to build as well. They're starting to build the Char B tank. And so their factories in essence are pretty full. So this idea of the French military saying to Samura, come on, you've got to build these things as well. It's quite a practical thing, because they're pushing them forward. They're trying to get these things done. Now, the very first hull is actually put out for trials in October, and those trials go on to December 1935. Because of the thickness of the cast armour they're starting to use, it comes in at 17 tonnes, not the earlier aimed for weight of around 13 tonnes. But the French, even though there's lots of problems with this vehicle, the French military see it has real potential, and they are really keen to back it. Now, like many countries, the actual turret that Samura are going to put on this tank actually comes from a different source. And this is the Atelier Pateau, or the French factory, or French design office in many ways, that is coming up with turrets for a number of other vehicles. And of course, this is where it can get quite confusing, because very similar turrets, even though there may be subtle differences, appear on the Char B, the Samura, and other French times of this period. But to start with, the French get the APX-1 turret put on these early test vehicles, and that particular turret, small, cast, and it's a one-man turret, which we'll see in a moment becomes part of the problem for the Samura and for a number of other French tanks as well. July 36 to March 37, tests are going on prototype versions of this AC2, and then later on to AC3. And much to everyone's surprise, but when you think about the political background going on, actually in March of 1936, before all these trials have actually been completed, 50 of the prototype AC4 vehicles, or that model of this Samura development, are actually ordered by the French military, 50 of them to go into service, even though trials of the other ones have not been completed yet. Now, what the French are actually hoping for is this newer turret that APX are developing, and that is going to be something called the APX-1 CE turret, and that basically, the CE stands for enlarged turret, and it's going to have a wider turret ring. But one of the problems that's going on is the supply of castings and some of this other material, and for those reasons we just need quickly have to have a look at the French politics, what's going on in France in that mid-1930s period. The Popular Front, it's actually a combined left and centre group, come to power in 1936. And one of the things that Popular Front movement brings with it is an anti-war profiteering movement. And that leads to a number of French design offices and military factories being nationalised under government control. And so things like the Hotchkiss, the Renault, Schneider Armour's plates factory at Le Creusot, the AMX plant, they all get nationalised. And as part of that process, what comes in is a 40-hour week for the French labourer. And that, on the whole, means a number of these factories only can complete one shift within the given week of 40 hours for a workman. They don't have multiple shifts, and that causes delays. So you're ending up, by 1938, about 48% of tank deliveries are late, and some considerably late. And what's going on is tanks are being delivered, sometimes even to the French army, but they're missing key components, sometimes weaponry, sometimes turrets. There's a parade in Paris, 1938, with the new Samura tanks in. They're missing their cast visors on the front of the vehicles and the side of the vehicles because they just haven't arrived yet in time. So that problem that's going on in the background, it also actually affects in another way, because the French cavalry, they like the Samura. I keep mentioning that fact. You know, they really want, this is the potential to be a great tank for the French military. But Jean Fabry, who's the new war minister, he actually goes to Weygand and he says to him, look, you are going to have to get more tanks into service sooner if we're going to meet our production aims and the increase in armour in the French military. And for that reason, the French cavalry take on the R35, basically an infantry tank, at the same time as the Samura developments going on, because basically what they're trying to do there is hedge their backs. Weygand's against the idea, but he's persuaded this is where the way he's got to go. Now, for the actual vehicle, when we're looking at this new turret is going to have the 47mm SA35mm gun on, 47mm SA35 gun as it's called. There's an earlier, shorter version, still 47mm, the SA34 gun. That's on those earlier turrets. The enlarged turret means what they're trying to do is make that turret wider, so the third crew member in the vehicle can help him load the gun. So the radio operator, who would normally sit at the front of the tank next to the driver, as you're facing forward on the right-hand side, he would be in a position to actually fit into the turret to help the commander load the gun and lessen the pressures and the stresses on there. So that's the turret they want, which has got delays, as I've mentioned, into getting into service. This APX-1 CE turret, but that gun is a very impressive gun. So you're looking at a gun there that can penetrate 35mm of armour plate at 400 metres, about the average tank engagement distance. It can go through pretty much any known German tank out to 1,000 metres in 1940. So this is a powerful anti-tank gun that they're putting on the vehicle. It's an impressive weapon. The problem again, though, is still that poor, slightly overworked commander there, because not only is he trying to command the tank, he might be trying to keep in formation with the rest of the section, and he's got that issue of aiming and firing the gun, even if he does have assistance from a loader that way. Now, the vehicle has a wheel in the front for the driver to help him steer this, and basically the turning circle depends on the gear and the speed you're going. It can almost turn on the spot in very, but without moving forward at all, as it were, but that arc of turn will increase depending on the speed you're going at. Samura, even though they're a truck manufacturer, they realise they haven't got an engine big enough, and even if you read in all the books, they call it a Samura 190 horsepower engine that's actually put in this tank. Actually, what they do is they copy a Lavia Sabine 190 CV V8 engine, which is out there. It's always in production. Basically, Samura buys the blueprints, do some changes, and put it in the back of this vehicle there. On the vehicle, the drive wheel is at the back, idler at the front. One of the criticisms is that idler is relatively low. So the vertical climb on this vehicle, what vertical wall it can get over, is actually relatively low down. But what they're trying to do is they put groupings there, 4 bogies down the side for suspension, each with leaf suspension on, with groupings of 2 wheels on each bogies, and 1 single wheel on a separate arm at the rear. As they go round the top that track, there's a skid run across the top with 2 rollers to assist the track to skid over the top there and then back all the way round. Now they start off, the track they put on the vehicle for the first 50 vehicles, 144 links at 75mm wide track. One of the problems is this trying to give the vehicle more stability and more cross-country ability. So after the 50th vehicle, they cut that down to 103 links, but 105mm wide track. So you've got a wider track on there. Another criticism of this vehicle, it seemed to be narrow and a bit tall, therefore top heavy. Again, that's one of those things that coming out in the wash, as it were, it doesn't seem to have affected it much in service, but it was an early criticism when they're testing the vehicle. Inside the vehicle, they set a automatic, quite novel for the time, automatic fire suppression system, 3 tanks of methyl bromide, that it's with jets aimed towards hotspots like carburetors, fuel pumps, etc. So should there be a fire, hopefully they'll be triggered to go off and eliminate that fire. And inside the vehicle, 2 fuel tanks. And one of the problems that we'll come on to is because so many of the crews with these vehicles have very little training time with them, there was a way you could actually think you filled the vehicle 100 litres and it's fully fueled up, when in fact you haven't actually touched the main fuel tank of 410 litres, and that could mean that you run out of fuel and panic ensues, as you can imagine, if you're on a battlefront. But that amount of fuel, once you're fully loaded up, gives you a range of about 230 kilometres. They can get up to speeds about 25 miles an hour, so you're looking at about 35 to 40 kilometres an hour there. It does have its problems. So even though we keep going on about how the French military really like this because of the thickness of the armour, the potential speed and mobility, it is a very hard vehicle to maintain. It's got these large castings from the Le Creusot works, 6 whopping great castings, and it takes a real effort to get to the engine to do maintenance. There's side skirts on the side of the suspension. These have to be lifted up before you can do any maintenance there. And that is a major criticism that comes back, is it's very labour intensive to try and keep this vehicle maintained and in operation. It's officially adopted in January 1938 by the French military. They've said in their 1936 programme they want 600 of these. They're putting together these new motorised divisions, 3 DLMs as the abbreviation is, for the French cavalry. But delays in getting them to the troops, even though French industry does very, very well in terms of actually ramping up production despite all these problems, to the point that it's actually overtakes German tank production in 1939. You've got the problem of some of these vehicles arriving that the troops can't fully train on because they don't have all the equipment there. The troops are having to train on earlier models, FT tanks, etc. And as part of one of the problems to get over this, what the French do is they start looking at, could we make the F-35 quicker and slightly cheaper? And for that they come up with a new design welded turret that they actually show off a model of in April of 1940, and they think they can start producing these relatively quickly. But look at that date, April of 1940, the fighting on the Western Front's about to begin again. And they also use a Samua to put a 75mm howitzer on, and they're looking at that as a way of trying to make a self-propelled artillery piece. And that one test vehicle is done. There's delays, even though they start the program in 38, there's delays. One vehicle, it ends up being used in France in the battle in 1940, but it really is an emergency measure. But the Samua that way, in terms of it was going to be simplified if French production had carried on. Now, even though this is a very good tank that starts getting to the French troops in the later 1930s, one of the other issues is how are the French really going to use this? And despite this very progressive sounding use of these new DLM, or the cavalry, the lighter mechanised divisions, that are going to be, in many ways, people compare them to a German Panzer division. The problems you can see, though, is how they fit in an overall French strategy that ultimately lets the French military down. And that's because this is the French idea, is you use a conscript army They are very nervous about a professional army. So when de Gaulle, as a tank man, is arguing in the early 1930s, we need to professionalize the force, we need very well-trained people to look at these new tactics could be done with mechanization and armored vehicles. The French military are nervous of this because the government wants the idea of the French military to be levée en masse. In other words, it's from the people. We increase the army when we need to. We don't like the idea of a professional elite force because that might threaten our government. And so the French actually cut conscription to a year, and that has problems for people like Weygand, because how are you going to have a well-trained tank crew that can only do a year's potential service in getting to know something, getting to know their skill sets, getting to know their vehicles, etc. And of course, with the Saumur S-35, it's only arriving with the French tank forces quite late on. Some of them, you know, earlier in the year of 1940, when the largest numbers are starting to come out of the factories, they're getting to the troops, and the troops have got very little chance to train with them before they have to go operationally. So this French defensive model of battle as well, that's after World War I. Think of the Maginot Line, how they see that as a static defence. Yes, they need an arm of decision. Yes, they need a mobile reserve. They recognise that. But they are still looking at this idea of the methodical battle, and that ties in with the idea of the conscript, who it's going to be therefore slow-paced and very, very simple how they will use their operations, because they don't have a sophisticated trained force to do anything other than that in many ways. And so these tanks are trying to fit into a system that perhaps seems to go against the idea of the exploitation, fast thought, fast manoeuvre. And this is compounded as well by the communication issues with French vehicles. Radios in France, again, we've talked all this 1930s period. It's against a background of a deep economic depression, industrial unrest, all sorts of other issues, as I've mentioned, going on in France that way. But also their radio production is not that good in terms of quality and even in quantity as well. So only 1 in 5 of the S-35 tanks end up getting issued with a radio. And there's another problem there, because French radio, the way they're supposed to be using these a lot of the time is with Morse code, and to be a well-trained Morse code operator, you need a fair bit of training. And we're back to, they've only had conscripts with a year's conscription, so they are actually lacking in skilled radio operators in their armoured forces, and much of the rest of the French army as well. So these are issues which compound, along with force formation. They're changing the organisations, they're changing how these vehicles are going to be used, just as the war is coming. The Germans, of course, on the other side, they've been looking at these problems. They've had the Anschluss, they had all their breakdowns, their mechanical problems going into Austria. They've been able to iron out many of those. They've looked at their operational art when they've gone into Poland and tried to iron out all these different things. So the force coming in the opposite direction is actually in a very different mindset and organisational ability than the French army in the spring of 1940. Now, this idea of the one-man turret we've talked about, this is often commented on about how that, as it was described as, you know, the one-man orchestra there, that idea of how on earth they were going to keep in command and control with, again, the lacking of the radio communication. So this is something else that is going to impact their battlefield. But one thing, you know, Steve Vologa very cleverly points out is careful we don't overdo that as well, because about a third of the German Panzer Force, Panzer I's coming the other way in May of 1940, they're also single one-man turrets. But their force formation, the Germans are putting their armour together. And again, Steve Vologa points out the fact that actually, in a way, this is a bit of an aberration. They've got, in essence, 10 panzer divisions that they keep most of the armour in, and that classic Schwerpunkt, you know, keeping it together, punching the hole at Sedan, going hell for leather for the coast. That's what their armour is doing. And we often come back with all these criticisms of the French of putting their tanks into this phrase penny packets, etc. But actually the French were doing what most armies were doing. So with their 3 DLM divisions, that they end up going together there. That's about 44% of the French tank force is in those specialised units. Almost 95% of the tank force is in the German units. But you only have to contrast that with a little bit later in the war, and you see how we just saying the French parcel out their forces in penny packets. It's a bit of a cruel criticism, because actually that's what every country did for most of the rest of the war. If you look at, for example, the Russians, later on, they've got about 44% of their armour only in specialised units. The Americans, 56%, are actually out there supporting the infantry, not in specified armoured divisions. And the Germans moved that way as well. About a quarter or a third of their armoured formations later on are actually out there with Panzerjäger, Sturmgeschütz, etc., supporting the infantry. So this idea of looking at the French in 1940 and saying, well, why did they spread their tanks out, not do what the Germans did? Well, number one, they didn't know where the Germans were coming. Number two, the Gamlin plan was that the light divisions go through Belgium into Holland, and as we know, the Germans come round in a different route. They go through the Ardennes, and the French tanks, including these S-35 that have gone into Holland and Belgium mainly at the Dial line, they have to retreat back. There is a major battle where S-35s proved their worth, over 1,000 tanks at Hanout early in May. These tanks tactically are very well used. The Germans register the fact that actually it's only because they concentrate their forces enough that they overcome the French resistance. And the French, of course, have the problem there, not just with their Char B tanks, but the S-35s, etc., is if they are leaving the battlefield, they can't recover a number of broken down tanks. And they've got lots of those issues so many tank forces face early on, which is the unreliability, the fact the troops are learning how to get the best from the vehicles still, and they can't recover those tanks back. So the idea of the penny packet one, yes, the Germans do tactical dominance in numbers. Strategically, actually, some of the things the French were doing is now we look back and we think that was silly. The idea they're deploying what is really their mobile reserve very early in the campaign. These are things that, again, we've got the benefit of hindsight. I'm not sure everybody would have been so critical of the French in 1940, because actually spreading tanks out was what most organisations did. Only the Germans keeping them together for that short period of time. So the failure of the French campaign in 1940 means that Germany ultimately captures the whole of the French territories. There is a worry in the Western Allies, Britain in particular. They're looking at this worry that finally, as France has got its French industry going, it's got tanks going into production, all a bit too late it seems, but that is going to be captured. And this is, I'm going to read you a British intelligence report, which was written actually in 1941. But it says here, at the time of the collapse of France, the equipment of the French army was, on the whole, of excellent quality and type, and factories in the industrial areas were keyed up to wartime production. New prototypes were being evolved and considerable research was in progress. It was therefore reasonable to expect that not only large quantities of captured war material would come into the use of the Axis armies, but that the Germans would endeavour to swing the whole industrial resource of occupied France into the manufacture of advanced French designs, in addition to the normal German equipment for use by the Axis. So there is a realisation that French tanks and French materiel is going to be used by the Axis forces fairly early on. And of course, that's exactly, we know what the Germans want to do. They actually recover about 297 of these vehicles. Around 400 are delivered before the fighting starts to the French military, of the 600 that were on order. What the Germans do, like so many times with captured equipment, they don't leave it completely the same. They add a Fug 5 radio, so there's a German radio antenna base. This is, by the way, this particular Samua is one of those that was captured and reused by the Germans. What they also do is the cupola on the top that was only used for observation by the commander. It wasn't actually a hatch. That they actually take the top off and they put two hatches in there. So even though it's a tight squeeze, the commander and actually other crew members could get out that way, of the three-man crew, could exit through the top there. The Germans then use these captured tanks. First of all, it seems like they're doing the typical thing, which is secondary internal security measures, Yugoslavia, etc. But these tanks end up being used on the Eastern Front in frontline roles. You'll see photographs, they go in pretty much where most German soldiers have ended up going. So they're in Russia, Finland, Yugoslavia. At least 10 of them are fighting the Americans in Normandy later after the D-Day landings. So they are respected by the Germans. They think they're a good tank, and everyone always comes out. There's lots of these different reports. You know, it's because of that thick armour, that idea that it's actually a much better tank than so many of the other earlier tanks, or Beutpanzers as the Germans use them, reused tanks that are taken in there. One of these tanks, by the way, is actually captured off the Germans by some of Tito's guerrillas, and they actually refit the tank with a 6-pounder gun. They put a box on the front so it's got enough room for the recoil, but there's some oddities out there you'll see based on a Saumur hull that way. Now, Vichy France actually negotiates with Germany about the continuing manufacture of the S-35 or that later S-40 model. It doesn't actually come to anything. But Vichy also asked permission to send some of their remaining tanks, and it may surprise you, but Vichy France was allowed to keep some tank forces after the initial settlement, the armistice in 1940. And the Vichy asked to send some of their Saumurs out to Senegal as a show of strength there to stop others having a go. And those Senegalese tanks that were sent there with Vichy forces after the invasion of Algeria and Tunisia by the Western Allies, those tanks end up going back and fighting for the Free French forces in Tunisia. So they see action at the end of the Tunisian campaign on the Allied side facing the Axis. And there's a stat somewhere that says there's about 17 Saumur S-35s left in North Africa at the end of that bit of the campaign. There's also other versions that are captured back off the Germans that then go into French forces, Free French forces used after the D-Day landings. Some S-35s are used to help the siege of La Rochelle. Some are used to recapture a French island. And by 1945, the French are registering, they've still got 17 Saumur S-35 tanks left. So not only German use, but other Allied use. There's some are given away as well by the Germans to other countries. So it looks like Hungary's given 2, Bulgaria 6, Italy's about 32 of these tanks. So they were in operation around the place. It's a tank that, again, this idea of how we look at it, some people would regard it as one of the best tanks of the 1930s. It is being supplied to troops at a time that they just can't actually operate them effectively. One, because of their organisational structures, in the way that there's not enough trained troops to actually use these. They're only getting used to them. The fact that they're conscripts who've only got a year's experience of the military is also problematic. And the fact that, as we know, overall strategically, how the French forces are used in France in 1940 is very questionable. But on the individual level, there are numerous accounts of very brave, again, French tank crewmen taking on German armour and in cases defeating them. And the Germans were very much aware of this. You know, their 1940 reports are the superior quality of French and British tanks in a number of engagements. The only way that they're getting across is by, number one, is their new novel tactics, sometimes going around, sometimes stopping the supplies or the petrol getting to these tanks by the speed, the manoeuvre of motion, against that very static seeming French philosophy of fighting. And that idea that somehow these were no good or in any way that way, they're not. They're very good tanks, but they're issued to a force that hasn't had the training time, is going through reorganisation, and ends up being employed in manners that now retrospectively we think of as being a failure. But again, a tank that then sees service throughout the war, and one that this particular example given to us by the French government, having seen use in German service as well, and a great tank for us to have in our collection.